Some farmers in the U.S. say the disruption of normal trade with China has forced many of them to go bankrupt.
Thousands of U.S. soybean containers were just rejected at a Chinese port. The reason, not disease, not war, simply because they came from America. None of the farmers in Iowa ever imagined this day would come when their products, once considered the global gold standard, would be turned away by some of their oldest trade partners. But this is the reality now. Not just one country, 10 nations in 2025 have either banned or severely slashed their imports of American agricultural goods. There were no headlines, no summits, just contracts canceled, shipments returned. And perhaps the most chilling part, Canada is replacing us silently, steadily, and with surgical precision. Today, let's expose the 10 countries that are quietly turning their backs on U.S. farm exports and shaking hands with our northern neighbor. If this trend continues, what kind of future is America really heading toward? Vietnam. On America's agricultural trade map, Vietnam has never been a hot zone, but that's exactly why its sudden halt of U.S. corn imports in 2025 sent chills through the system, because when even the smaller markets turn away, it signals a deeper fracture in a much larger machine. There was no political conflict, no diplomatic standoff. Just this U.S. corn shipments could no longer pass Vietnam's increasingly strict quarantine standards. Meanwhile, the exact same product stamped Canada sailed through inspection with ease, enjoying a significantly higher clearance rate. In just the first half of the year, Vietnam slashed U.S. corn imports by more than 70%, while sharply increasing purchases from Canada and Australia. For the average Vietnamese consumer, not much changed. But for American workers, especially in corn-producing states like Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois, this was the start of a new domino collapse. As Vietnam backed out, major corn shipping contracts at 2 key West Coast ports were canceled. A cold storage facility in Arkansas built specifically to serve the Asian market was forced to cut its operations by 40%. Hundreds of long-haul truck drivers lost their contracts temporarily, and no one knows how long that temporary will last. The danger lies in the chain reaction. Each lost market means a job, lost a family without income, and a rural community scrambling to pay off debts for fertilizer equipment and fuel. If a small country like Vietnam can cause damage this far-reaching, the next question becomes who's next? And what happens if not one, but 5 or 10 countries close their doors at the same time? What would be left for America's farmers? Some storms don't roar. They simmer, and Vietnam is that silent storm, the one quietly opening the floodgates to a decline that may be impossible to reverse. The next storm, it won't come from a small corner of the world, but from a country that was once America's biggest buyer, now quietly turning away. Not out of spite, but because it no longer needs U.S. crops. China. When a country like Vietnam pulls away, the U.S. loses a potential market. But when China makes a move, the entire export balance shifts. This past March, China officially imposed a 34% tariff on certain categories of U.S. soybeans and meat, a move described as a technical trade measure. Though everyone understood the message, it was a direct hit to the heart of American agriculture. Within 3 weeks of the policy taking effect, U.S. soybean exports to Asia plummeted by nearly 60%. Buyers in Shanghai and Shenzhen began signing long-term deals not with the U.S., but with Brazil and Canada. There was no formal announcement, no diplomatic exchange. Just this America was no longer the first choice. This pivot wasn't new, but it was the most decisive one yet. Because this time, China wasn't seeking a temporary replacement. They were restructuring their entire agricultural supply chain with one condition: zero reliance on the United States. The consequences were almost immediate. In Illinois, once proud to be the soybean capital of America, hundreds of thousands of tons of harvested beans sat idle in storage. A drying plant in Macomb entered technical hibernation, operating just 3 days a week. In Iowa, soybean prices dropped below $9 per bushel, less than the cost of production. Many farmers were forced to delay planting the next crop, knowing they'd lose more money by moving forward. Some large-scale operators canceled land leases altogether to cut losses, triggering a ripple effect that hit small landowners who relied on rental income. In Missouri, domestic transport companies lost dozens of routes shipping goods to West Coast ports. The shock spread even to seemingly unrelated sectors like packaging, wooden pallet suppliers, and mid-tier logistics services. And all of it began with one country's decision. What makes China dangerous isn't just that it's America's largest agricultural customer, it's that it has the power to set a global precedent. Other nations follow. When China says that's enough, smaller markets suddenly feel emboldened to do the same. Canada understood this, and they moved fast. While U.S. soybean stockpiles sat immobile, Canada ramped up grain exports to Asia. They restructured trans-Pacific trade routes. They fast-tracked negotiations with ports in Busan, Taipei, and Manila. Meanwhile, in the U.S., cold storage trucks ran at half capacity. Co-ops took out loans just to fuel grain dryers. And farmers stared at darkened, moisture-ridden soybeans, knowing full well they wouldn't sell on the international market. Sometimes collapse doesn't come with a bang. It starts with a contract that's not renewed, a phone call that never comes. And with each passing day, Americans slowly realize they no longer control the supply chains that they once built. And if a country of over 1 billion people can casually reject American crops, what happens when wealthier, more refined markets decide they want cleaner, safer, and that no longer includes the United States? European Union. To Americans, the word Europe has long evoked images of premium markets, stable, civilized, and reliable. But in 2025, something previously unthinkable happened. The EU began rejecting U.S. agricultural products not because of politics, but because of safety standards. Starting in Q1 of this year, the EU implemented new regulations on chemical residue limits and crop origin traceability, specifically targeting genetically modified corn and commonly used herbicides, like paraquat substances still widely applied across many American farms. The backlash didn't come as an outright ban, but through a legal chokehold export licenses delayed documentation, rejected due to missing certifications and shipments held at port for up to 21 days pending inspection, long enough to spike logistics costs and cause many buyers to quietly walk away. And into that vacuum stepped Canada. No flashy campaigns. No slashed prices. Just one simple line printed on packaging certified organic, compliant with EU standards. That was all it took for supermarket chains in Germany, France, and Belgium to sign long-term contracts with suppliers from Saskatchewan and Manitoba regions, once considered fallback options when the US couldn't meet demand. Across the Atlantic, a chill began to set in for American producers. In Indiana, home to over 15,000 mid-sized corn farms, thousands of tons of late-season corn were now stuck in the yard, unable to meet European standards. Some cooperatives tried pivoting to the domestic market, but low sale prices and rising transport costs evaporated any profit. In Minnesota, many GMO corn farmers now face a no-win equation switch to traditional varieties to qualify for the EU, which requires overhauling their entire farming system or stay the course and risk being cut out of nearly 20% of their export market. What makes the situation worse is the double choke point. The US doesn't prohibit exports, but the EU is tightening imports, and Canada just happens to be perfectly positioned between those two currents. At the port of Rotterdam Q2, data showed Canada surpassed the US in corn imports for the first time since 2001. That milestone left many American exporters bitter a market loyal for 2 decades, now lost over a few technical clauses. And the people, especially working-class Americans, are beginning to ask tough questions if cornfields passed down through generations are now silently dismissed. How much time do other industries have left to prepare? But the EU isn't the only one tightening its grip under the banner of safety standards. There's another country quieter, smaller, yet making moves just as cold and calculated. And when that pivot is complete, it won't be corn at risk, but another cornerstone of American agriculture now poised to be pushed to the edge of global trade: Brazil. Brazil was once a reliable partner in America's agricultural trade, stepping in during drought supply chain shocks or as a temporary substitute. But in 2025, that backup role vanished because Brazil has officially stepped up to challenge the US head-on. After US tariff moves earlier this year aimed at protecting domestic metallurgy and raw material industries, Brazil hit back with the weapon America least expected: agriculture. In April, the Brazilian government announced a retaliatory tariff package of up to 120% on US sourced corn, soybeans, and wheat, citing the need to safeguard South America's regional supply chain and prevent unfair competition. But the deeper truth is this: Brazil no longer needs the US. They want its place. In under 3 months, Brazilian grain giants like Amag SLC Agricola and Cofco International expanded their procurement operations and invested heavily in new logistics routes, linking the agricultural heartland of Mato Grosso to ports in the north. Simultaneously, short-term U.S. grain contracts with the Caribbean, Africa, and the Middle East, once flexible fallback markets, were swiftly taken over by Brazil. The fallout wasn't just in lost tonnage. America officially lost its global reputation as the go-to fallback supplier, a role that once kept U.S. farmers afloat in lean years. In Arkansas, hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat originally destined for Nigeria now sit idle, rerouted for domestic use, but there's no demand. Prices have dropped to their lowest since 2017. In Kansas, flour mills were forced to cancel production contracts for the Middle East as buyers switched to Brazilian supply offered at lower prices thanks to new tax-free streamlined logistics chains. Even ports like New Orleans saw routine shipping lanes to Latin America dry up with no stable demand to sustain them. Logistics firms posted Q2 losses due to maintaining crews with no goods moving through. For Brazil, agricultural trade isn't just about exports, it's about soft power. They invest in infrastructure, build a reputation for quality, and offer price stability. When buyers need help, Brazil shows up. And the US companies still produce quality goods. But when tariffs raise costs, paperwork gets messy, and signals turn erratic, international buyers stop waiting. They take the easier route. And that route no longer runs through the American Midwest. As for everyday Americans, they feel the consequences in small but persistent ways. An agricultural supply store in Nebraska cuts its opening hours due to fewer orders. A cooperative in South Dakota applies for interest subsidies after failing to sell their spring crop. For lease signs pop up across farmland not because the soil has failed, but because no one dares to plant anymore. Brazil has completed its transformation from laggard to leader, and they did it fueled by global disappointment in America's supply chain. But while Brazil used strength to seize markets, another nearby country is applying a much subtler strategy. No tariffs, no declarations, just quietly replacing America, product by product, with contracts that are cleaner, safer, and more reliable. Mexico. For most American farmers, Mexico used to be a dependable plan B. When Europe grew too demanding, when China turned away, when the Middle East became unstable, Mexico was always there, close, negotiable, and consistently hungry. It all started with a conflict that had nothing to do with agriculture steel tariffs. When the U.S. imposed steep duties on steel imports from Mexico in early 2025 to protect its domestic industry, Mexico didn't respond with words, but with action. It retaliated with tariffs targeting American beef, corn, and other agricultural goods. And just like that, a relationship built on geography and habit turned into a real trade rivalry. In Mexico City and Guadalajara's wholesale markets, which once consumed hundreds of thousands of tons of U.S. corn, each year new sacks now bear labels from Brazil, Argentina, and even Ukraine. Canada, offering clean package shipments with high-quality certifications, has quickly muscled into Mexico's beef and pork supply chains, areas once dominated almost exclusively by producers from Texas and Iowa. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a strategic shift. As Mexico pushes to diversify its supply sources, it seeks partners who are not only cheaper, but also more stable, and who won't drag them into future tariff disputes. And that is costing the U.S. dearly. In states like Texas and New Mexico, where exports of beef and corn to Mexico form a major economic backbone, ranches are downsizing their herds. Not because of weak domestic demand, but because international orders are now in clinical death. A slaughterhouse in El Paso had to shut down weekend operations after a shipment to Mexico was returned due to a 25% tariff hike. Rising cold storage and labor costs left the business unable to turn inventory fast enough to survive. In Nebraska, a 3-generation family farm failed to secure a seasonal contract with a Mexican exporter for the first time since 1998. The owner said they're considering selling off equipment and skipping seasonal hires altogether. Losing Mexico means U.S. farmers didn't just lose a customer, they lost their last regional fallback in the Americas. In their place, Brazil and Canada, once sidelined players at the southern border, are now stepping up as primary suppliers, backed by favorable shipping policies, competitive pricing, and zero political entanglements. And the United States. Once you're no longer the default choice for your neighbors, the reputation you spent decades building can vanish in just one harvest cycle. That's exactly what's happening now. At farm markets across the American South, farmers no longer talk about price or profit. They speak of survival chances and making it one more year. And as Mexico pivots toward pragmatism, another high-end consumer market, one that used to favor American goods for their reliability, is now asking a tougher question. Do they even need the US anymore when there's a cleaner, easier partner available? Japan. Sometimes a country doesn't need to impose tariffs or announce canceled contracts, it simply needs to choose a different product. And when that choice comes from Japan, one of the world's most discerning and high-end consumer markets, the consequences for the US go far beyond numbers. Since early 2025, US beef imports into Japan have dropped by nearly 40%, not because of high prices or supply shortages, but due to a reason that cuts deep for American farmers waning trust in food safety, after a suspected case of mad cow disease surfaced at a livestock facility in the southern US. Though still unconfirmed, major Japanese retailers like Aeon and Ito-Yokado simultaneously suspended all US beef orders for at least 6 months to reassess safety standards. They didn't condemn. They didn't call a press conference. They simply shifted to Canada and Australia, 2 countries that have spent the past decade building a reputation for clean, reliable beef. There was no noise, but in Kansas it hit like a storm. A mid-sized meat processing plant in Salina, which had supplied beef for Japanese contracts, abruptly announced layoffs for 120 workers, mostly Latino laborers who had worked 6 days a week. Pre-signed livestock contracting deals with local farmers were also canceled without notice. In small towns like Garden City and Dodge City, where the local economy relies heavily on beef, grocery stores, gas stations, and even public schools began to feel the ripple effect. One lost international order was enough to shake an entire community, not because they didn't have beef to sell, but because no one was buying. Meanwhile, Canada recorded record-high beef exports to Asia, partly thanks to newly secured Japanese contracts. This wasn't the first time Japan enforced strict food standards, but it was the first time they replaced a supplier entirely in less than 3 months. And that reveals a harsh truth. No market is loyal to America if confidence in its standards fades. Behind the export numbers are thousands of American families losing jobs, livelihoods, and the ability to sustain ranches passed down through generations. A 300-head cattle farm in Kansas is now forced to sell off part of its herd to pay the bank-cut feed costs and skip summer hiring. The U.S. beef label was once a symbol of quality, but in a market like Japan, which demands perfection, even a small crack in trust can bring everything down. And once a market pivots away, few ever return unless the US can prove that its products are not just clean, but cleaner than its competitors. As Japan quietly walks away over technical concerns, another country less picky but more culturally resolute is making a different kind of decision to reject American imports, not for safety, but because they no longer align with national values. South Korea. South Korea isn't the largest importer of American agricultural products, but because of its compact market size and highly selective consumer habits, every decision from Seoul sends ripples, especially in the processed food sector. Since late 2024, following a scandal involving US origin frozen processed meat, found to exceed the allowable sodium limit, major supermarket chains in South Korea, including Emart, Lotte-Mart, and HomePlus, simultaneously announced they would suspend imports of certain U.S. processed meat products in 2025. What seemed like a minor stumble turned out to be the beginning of a shift in consumer behavior that no one in the American Midwest could have anticipated. South Korea once considered a guaranteed market for American deli meats. Sausages and bacon suddenly began importing fresh fruits from Canada. Cherries, apples, pears, products rarely mentioned in U.S. Korea trade now dominate premium grocery shelves, replacing meats that once ruled the convenience segment. In Washington state, once proudly home to the nation's leading fruit farms, exporters were blindsided as major Korean buyers turned instead to Canadian suppliers. Why better yield, more reliable cold chain logistics, and most importantly, fewer scandals. For Korean consumers, a food quality incident isn't just a health concern, it's a cultural shock. Once trust is lost, they pivot without looking back. And this pivot has forced many U.S. processed meat plants to downsize operations, particularly in states like Nebraska and South Dakota. One facility in Sioux Falls, which used to run 24/7 to fulfill Asian contracts, now operates only 4 days a week. Workers have been reduced to part-time, and many technical staff were let go in a Q2 round of layoffs. Worse still, as U.S. processed meats were pushed off South Korean shelves, other Asian importers also grew wary. No one wants to carry the image risk of a product tainted by a technical error, even if it's only temporary. Meanwhile, Canada quietly signed new export deals for cherries, apples, and fresh meat, expanded storage facilities at ports like Busan and Incheon, and even launched direct-to-consumer sales through Korean platforms like Coupang and Gmarket. And the US locked out not by tariffs, but by a loss of consumer confidence. No outright bans, no official trade embargoes, but a single slip in standards triggered a consumer response, one far more powerful and unforgiving than any administrative order. And those on the front lines of U.S. food production, the people who once made products that were a source of national pride, are now the first to be sidelined. No purchase orders, no contracts, no production schedules. Only idle production lines, cold storage units on standby, and families debating whether to exit the business after 3 generations. But the worst isn't over, because after discerning countries like South Korea, a rising economy is quietly planning to break free from America's trade influence, not because they're forced to, but because they believe the time has come. Saudi Arabia. The Islamic world has always had its own set of standards, and that's nothing new. But in 2025, halal requirements have evolved beyond religious rituals. They've become a powerful tool of trade filtration. And Saudi Arabia, the economic powerhouse of the Middle East, has used that very tool to quietly remove the United States from the global poultry table. After a series of random inspections at Jeddah and Dammam ports, multiple shipments of frozen chicken from the US were found lacking officially recognized halal certifications. Immediately, the Saudi government didn't issue a loud public ban, it simply stopped granting new import permits. No announcements. No retaliation. But the results were clear. Starting in Q2 of 2025, the US virtually disappeared from Saudi Arabia's list of official poultry suppliers. And who stepped in Canada? Poultry companies in Ontario and Quebec, which had invested in halal-compliant slaughter chains nearly a decade ago, were suddenly pushed to the front of the line. According to Canada's Agricultural Export Authority, poultry exports to Saudi Arabia surged by nearly 47% in just 5 months, the highest rate on record. In the US, the shock wasn't just about losing orders, it was about losing trust from one of the most stable markets in the global processed food industry. In Georgia and Arkansas, home to many of the nation's leading poultry processing plants, production lines that once ran non-stop are now slowing down. A major facility in Springdale announced a 15% cut in June production solely because Middle Eastern orders suddenly vanished. Hundreds of chicken containers were removed from export schedules and redirected to the domestic market. But at home, demand is weak, leading to mounting inventory, falling prices, and farmers selling below cost just to keep cash flow alive. A farm in Mississippi, which had long been a contract supplier for a Middle East-focused exporter, was forced to temporarily shut down its 3rd barn and lay off 20 seasonal workers. They didn't break any rules, the market just turned its back quietly and coldly. Meanwhile, Canadian companies not only made sales, they gained moral credibility in production. For the Islamic world, halal integrity is paramount. And while the US relaxed oversight, Canada steadily built trust from each package, each tray of meat, each certificate. And when that trust eventually changed hands, it happened subtly but decisively. Consumers in Riyadh, Mecca, or Medina, when they now look at a tray of meat, no longer see product of USA. They see the red maple leaf, and they feel reassured. In the US, farmers simply know that containers haven't been booked, contracts haven't been renewed, and plants aren't taking new orders. And there's nothing they can do because this isn't about price or policy anymore. It's about culture and trust. Once you've lost moral credibility in a religious market, no marketing strategy is strong enough to win it back. But if a religion-based market can be this decisive, then what happens when a purely pragmatic country, one that was once America's diamond trade partner, also begins quietly seeking its own path? Egypt. Egypt, one of the world's oldest and most wheat-dependent civilizations, where millions rely on daily meals of flatbread, doesn't just buy grain, it buys peace of mind. And when a single seed of doubt was found in a shipment from the US, the country responded with force. It closed the door entirely on American wheat. It began with a shipment that arrived at the port of Alexandria in February 2025. A random inspection by Egypt's Food Safety Authority detected traces of chlorpyrifos, a pesticide banned in many European countries and flagged as controversial by the World Health Organization. The Egyptian government didn't wait for a second test. A nationwide ban on US wheat was issued almost immediately, halting all new orders. In the weeks that followed, the news rippled quickly across North Africa. Importers in Morocco, Tunisia, and even Jordan, though issuing no formal declarations, quietly began shifting their sourcing. And that alone was enough for Canada, once dismissed as too far and too costly, to swoop in. Between March and June 2025, Canada's Ministry of Agriculture reported that wheat exports to North Africa rose by over 15%, driven largely by deals replacing the US. Canada didn't do anything revolutionary, they were simply cleaner, more stable, and available at the right moment. On the US side, the damage wasn't just in trade numbers. In North Dakota and Montana, where wheat farming depends heavily on African and Middle Eastern markets, farmers felt like their oxygen supply had been cut off. One exporter in Bismarck reported halting all shipments to Egypt, a market that had accounted for 38% of its Q1 revenue. In Minnesota, a major flour processing plant servicing North African orders had its production schedule slashed in half. Hundreds of tons of milled wheat had to be sold slowly in the domestic market at a loss of 12 to 18% compared to expected export prices. While Canada invested in expanding grain storage at the port of Algiers to meet new demand in the region, U.S. factories were negotiating fire sales for their containers. A facility in Fargo, a regional production anchor, had to request emergency credit to avoid laying off its entire night shift operations team. They had no plan B. Everyone assumed Egypt would remain loyal. But when food safety is called into question, loyalty means nothing. Egyptians may be poorer, but they will not accept chemically tainted wheat. And their decisive stance sparked a broader regional trade shift. More importantly, once Africa, a continent with rapidly growing populations, starts learning to say no to cheap contaminated agricultural goods, the entire U.S. supply axis across developing nations may need to be rewritten from scratch. Because clean food is no longer a luxury reserved for premium markets, it's becoming the baseline requirement even in the harshest corners of the world. From Asia to Europe, from discerning consumers to middle-income nations, the United States is gradually being pushed off the table not by major trade wars, but by small oversights, neglected standards, and a complacency rooted in its superpower status. Meanwhile, Canada, despite facing tariffs and staying quiet, is steadily stepping in, replacing one position after another with stability, transparency, and perfect timing. The question now is no longer, which markets is America losing, but rather, how many more will walk away before U.S. farmers can adapt? Are we entering an era where Canada becomes the preferred name, and the U.S. just a fallback option? This video does not encourage division within the United States or promote separatism. All content is presented for the purpose of exploration analysis and sparking public conversation based on current events, social trends, and emotional realities. We respect the U.S. Constitution and all federal regulations. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe, and turn on notifications, so you won't miss our upcoming analyses where we uncover the stories mainstream media often leave behind. Who do you think will be the next country to say no to American farm products, and what should Americans prepare for before the next harvest season arrives? Share your thoughts in the comments below.